Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to your group. I hope some of what I present will be relative to your region. The title is Intermittent and Ephemeral Streams. I call it Their Day in the Sun because a lot of the research that has been done on these rivers, in the Southwest, has been done on the perennial and perennial streams and highly intermittent streams. Yeah, even though the ephemeral and intermittent streams are the most abundant stream type certainly in Arizona, but also in much of the world. But they're not as exciting to study because most of them there's often not water there, so they just haven't attracted the level of research. But that is changing. People are becoming aware of their importance when we're looking at river networks and realizing that you have these perennial streams, but you have these tributaries that are feeding into them, and we can't ignore these extensive ephemeral and intermittent streams as researchers or managers. And so you can take your pick of either one of these quotes to read and get something out of it that's relevant to the talk. So, the point being is a lot we don't know. I'm not going to go into but some of the things we do know is that the water sources in these ephemeral and intermittent streams can vary within a species, between a stream. Water sources include stored runoff from summer storms, winter storms. That suffices for some species. Others are facultative phreatophytes, mesquite having a very flexible root system. In some areas it can, like the Sacktown, if there's sufficient water, it can be sustained by summer monsoon runoff. But it can also, it has a very deep root and can access deep water tables. Root depth of these trees, that's something that is unknown. I'm trying to put together a database on root depths of riparian species, but there's a lot of information gaps. We also know that the trees in these systems influence the water cycle, and you can have water moving from wet surface soils to the deeper soils, and that'll influence water sources for other plants. Another thing we know about these systems is that there's a high degree of temporal variability. You all know, living here, you can go have these prolonged drought cycles and sort of boom and bust, and then you get into a flood period. And the cycling, or this unpredictability and episodic events really dictates the establishment of many of these tree species. One in particular that I've worked on is Arizona sycamore, and in some cases you can go, along some streams, you can go a decade or 2 decades without the appropriate conditions for recruitment. Recruitment appears to be tied to these winter flood events that create the most soils when the seeds are germinable, and then a summer flood can cause mortality, so you need the right conditions of winter flooding, no summer floods. And in this part of the region, or part of the state, that doesn't occur all that frequently. And so you have these episodic establishment events that are occurring over the course of decades. So high temporal variability. So you have temporal variability, but there's also spatial variability in water. Spatial variability in water availability. And many of the streams in our state, there's some that are ephemeral over their entire length, some that are perennial over their entire length, but then there are many that are called interrupted perennial or interrupted intermittent. And Meisner in 1923 defined these terms. And so a perennial interrupted stream is one that has perennial stretches with meaning in ephemeral reaches. So, for example, the San Pedro is an example of this. Sonoita Creek, Cienega Creek, Hacienda River. Most of our desert rivers fall into this category of or if they get farther and farther away in space. And is there any, are the plants and animals that are growing at these intermittent or ephemeral reaches, are they influenced by having a perennial reach upstream? So that's one thing that's been interesting, capturing the attention of my research group for a little bit. And I want to say, for this next study I'm going to present, I'm not talking about trees. I'm going to focus on the herbaceous plant species because I just pulled some data from some local floras, and you can see that the herbaceous plant species, the herbaceous perennials, the annuals, these are really the majority of plants in a flora. So you have a few dominant trees, but then large numbers of annuals and herbaceous perennials. So that's what the next segment's going to focus on. And I hope you like the colors. Decided, ooh, nice and sunny. It's real fire season. Yeah, fire season. So one question that I asked, and the co-authors that I put listed on the study that are Gabrielle Katz and Michael Denslow, who are from another ASU. I'm from Arizona State University, they're from Appalachian State University. We were asking this question of how does plant diversity composition vary among these different reach types within an interrupted river. So we chose 3 rivers: Hacienda, the San Pedro, Lower San Pedro, and then Lower Cienega Creek. And within each of these, we selected perennial stretches, intermittent stretches, and ephemeral stretches. And we were focusing on this, the stream side cover during the dry season of the year. So we weren't looking at how floods are affecting these, but what's going on during the times when we weren't looking at the summer monsoon floods, we were looking at the pre-monsoon dry season. And so our first result is, that's what you expect. The perennial reaches have more cover, they have more plant species per unit area, they have more, okay, they have more species that are of wetland affinity, so that's what you'd expect in our perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral categories. But we were also looking, this was a multi-year study, and for the San Pedro, Gabrielle and Michael have been looking at the San Pedro, monitoring the same plots for 8 years now, and we have 4 years of data for the Hacienda, 2 for the Cienega. So we were asking the question of, well, what is plant diversity like over time? I mean, this is a snapshot, point in time diversity. But what if we look over the long term? You're taking these environmental variability, where in some years are going to be better than others. Well, we did find a surprising phenomenon. We found that time. The pattern of time differs versus the point in time snapshot. Let me rephrase that. That didn't come out right. When you look over multiple years, we find that the intermittent streams, shown in blue here, are the ones that accumulate more species through time. And these are 3 sites each. This is 8 years. These are 3 sites each. 2 years, 3 sites each. 4 years. And the other interesting thing is that these curves just keep going up. It's like you could keep studying these rivers every year and you pick up more species. So this temporal dimension is really fascinating. And so I'm going to pretend like you're in a class that I teach at ASU and say, why? Explain this to me. Here's the pattern. What's the process? Yes.
I would say it's kind of like an edge effect. When you've got the intermittence, I mean, the wet stuff is just pretty much always wet. The ephemeral stuff is mostly pretty much dry. The intermittent is what gets both of them. So I say you kind of have a bit of an edge effect going on, where you do have species from both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and so, oh, go ahead.
Intermediate disturbance effect. Intermediate levels of disturbance so that the competitive dominants don't take over in a more stable situation, but you don't have the extremes that you would have in a completely arid environment.
Right. And so those are tying into the answer. We call this, the editors wanted us to come up with a snazzy title, and so we call it the Goldilocks. I mean, if the, just in terms of assessing the pattern of species richness. And yeah, at the perennial sites, you have dense cover, not a lot of turnover of species per year. You have sort of competition restricting turnover through time. The dry sites is just too dry continuously, but at the intermittent sites, periodically you'll have wet years and you don't have the competitive cattails or bulrush, and you can have species replacement. So yes, so you have so the intermittent streams are quite interesting in this regard. Now along the perennial reaches, there are a core set of plants that are restricted to these perennial sites. They need the year-round water. There's the obligate wetland plants. So these are core riparian plants, and many of these are perennial: Tory rush, third sneezeweed, Yerbamansa, sneezeweed. Yeah, I don't know why it's called. It doesn't look like it would make you sneeze. But anyway, someone looked that up on their laptop. But then on the intermittent channels, there are a set of species that you tend to find along the ephemeral intermittent channels. And many of these are annuals that certainly aren't going to be there every year, but they're there opportunistically when the conditions are right. So that led us to the question of, well, where are these seeds coming from? If in any given year, you're usually going to find a low species richness at your intermittent or ephemeral site, but through time, you have lots of species. So where are the seeds coming from? For 5 points. I'm teaching, I can't.
Wind and upstream. Upstream and wind.
Okay. Sea banks. Yeah. So, gosh, I'm sorry.
You're not that restricted, no.
Okay. Yeah, so our lab has done quite a bit of work on soil seed banks, and there are, we've taken the cores and the soil and grow the plants out in a greenhouse, so you have get the annual cycle, the summer species, the winter species. And we did a seed bank study on the Hacienda River, where we were actually looking at what is in the seed bank with distance, in these ephemeral reaches, with distance from a perennial, because there's 8 miles of perennial flow in the Hacienda River. And we were wondering if distance to a perennial reach influenced the seed composition in these ephemeral reaches. And we found that it does. And so here's a perennial reach. And then as you move farther downstream, this figure is supposed to generally parallel this map. And so you have these ephemeral sites that are near the perennial sites do harbor a richer assemblage of species. So that if you did have a flood pulse come, they'd be available to germinate. Then you get farther downstream, and then the diversity of the seed bank drops off. But that certainly doesn't explain all of the whole pattern. And so hydrochory is another key process. And
what is hydrochory?
Hydrochory is transport of seeds by water. So chory is movement or transport of water. And someone at the end asked me why I put an otter in this picture. I'm not going to tell you right now. But
They eat the seeds.
Anyway, so hydropory has been studied on several perennial rivers, and people know that particularly during flood flows, you can have the floods moving seeds from the riparian zone to the river, back and forth, and we have yet to do any hydropory studies on an intermittent or ephemeral stream. I think that's something that we'd like to do next. I did have a student who just finished her master's, Jackie Betch, did a hydropory study on the Verde River, which is continuously perennial. But I think some of the results probably carried over to at least to an intermittent stream. And one of her main findings, well, what she did, first of all, was she used seines and stood in the water for many, many hours, capturing seeds throughout the year, and then took her samples and grew them out in the greenhouse. So she was seeing what seeds were in the water and then what was germinating at that particular time. And so one of the big findings was that these flood pulses, shown in these arrows, these are times when you have increased movement of seeds, and these are the obligate wetland, facultative wetland, upland species. And so these flood pulses are, even though during the seasonal dry season, even during the base flow season, you still have some seeds being carried. But really, it's these flood pulses that are distributing seeds throughout the watershed. And throughout the river network. And another interesting thing she found is that there are some species that we call them pulse species. She found them, things like cottonwood and willow. She found them in her seines, seed traps, at the same time that they were dispersing in the field. And this is also the same time at which they germinate. And so these are species that are really tied to a particular timing of a flood event. But then there was another set of species that we called constant species, and these are species that would likely be found in a seed bank. They're long-lived seeds, and they're opportunistic. They can germinate. So the seeds, like cattail and cypress, rabbit's foot grass, the seeds are, whenever she went out there, she found seeds of these species in the water, independent of when they were dispersing seeds, so they're probably mobilized from seed banks. And so if you had a flood occur at any of these times, these would be deposited and they'd be able to germinate. And so we're getting at some of the mechanisms that are enabling these plant communities to respond to the temporal variability in the hydrology of these systems. So, conservation implication. You can't give a talk without saying more research needed. I've done all the research that anyone ever needs to do. 5 minutes.
Yeah, a little more, I got 8.
Oh, well, almost done. So that was, thank you. Okay. I just want that, so that's sort of a wrap up of what we've done on those types of streams. I did want to briefly introduce another project that we just got going on, and this is being funded in part by the Department of Defense, and the idea is to gain a better understanding of intermittent and ephemeral streams on military bases. And so we're working in the Huachuca Mountains. We've established sites on intermittent and perennial and then ephemeral reaches of 3 different canyons. And we're asking some of the same kind of questions. So we have some of our sites that are just on, they're not connected to perennial headwaters, and some of our sites are. How does that affect the composition and turnover of the species? How does the underlying site hydrology affect the vegetation? Looking at the seasonal variability. So don't really have any results yet for that, but I did want to introduce that particular proposal, or project that we're working on. And then just say thank you. Do we have time for 2 questions?
I just really like the color scheme along with your shirt. I mean, it's very visually pleasing.
That was the most important thing. Yes, that's, yeah.
Regarding the distances covered by the different designated streams and rivers in the state, what changes have occurred over, say, the last century or whatever in regard to quantitative mileage of these different categories?
Yeah, well, that's where it comes down to just doing this river by river or region by region work. That map for the San Pedro, there's been a lot of work done there. People digging and saying, here's where the historical reaches were. So in the San Pedro, we know that the perennial reaches have contracted. Other rivers, say the Haciampa, seem to have been more stable through time. The Santa Cruz certainly has reduced its number of perennial flows. But then you have this added twist that some of the reaches are now receiving municipal effluent. And so you may have a reach that went from a perennial stream with shallow groundwater to a dewatered basin, and now it has surface water, but it still doesn't have groundwater in it. So that's just, ADWR has some of this information, but that's another statewide effort that needs to go on with regional groups taking an effort at that. So I don't have an answer for them.
Are there any approximate figures as far as quantitative changes?
Surprisingly, not. I mean, you can talk about changes in the length of perennial flow versus intermittent and ephemeral flow. You can also talk about changes in the area of the riparian vegetation, because you may still have a perennial river, but it's been replaced by cotton field or agricultural land. So the Colorado River is still mostly perennial, but its riparian area, its riparian vegetation has lost quite a bit. So that both of those components, see how I'm avoiding your question? Adding another question in? So no, we don't, surprisingly we don't, there aren't good figures. I mean, someone should do it, it's not that difficult.
Have the various causes of the changes been identified?
Yes, and and certainly in some rivers you've had the groundwater pumping, surface water diversion are key causes. Other rivers where you've had a dam put in that's a flow regulating dam, but not a diversion dam, on the, say, the Bill Williams River below Alamo Dam, there are some reaches of the Bill Williams that actually have more, well, since the dam has gone in, the extent of perennial reaches has increased because they've basically taken this hydrograph that, and just dampened both extremes. So the floods aren't as big and the boat base flows are longer. So it really depends on what that river is being managed for.
Would that be a positive aspect of a dam?
Yes. Yes. There are some positive aspects.
You decrease your biodiversity, though.
Well, if you had some intermittent reaches and you converted the whole thing to a perennial flow, yes, that would reduce biodiversity. But there are still segments of the Bill Williams that still retain intermittent flow, so it's a moderate shift. It's
You've
not
got the Santa Maria River that flows into Bill Williams too, which is undammed and it's pretty much ephemeral.
yeah.
Excuse me, it is ephemeral.
I know there have been some mines in that general area. I'm not really sure about how that the water flows have changed. Maybe you just need local watershed groups with local knowledge. Yeah, you only have 1 minute.
Somebody back here whispered it, and I was hoping somebody would ask, so I'll ask. This has implications for the spread of invasive species as well, and I was wondering if she found any in her seed collection, or if you know of anybody who plans on taking the research in that direction with how would this kind of stuff affect the spread of invasive species in the riparian areas?
Jackie does have a list of attributes of the species she found. Who am I looking for? A list of attributes, seed attributes, or attributes of the seeds she found being dispersed. And so whether a species came from another country or originated here, it's pretty rare to find really strong differences in traits between native and non-native species. So the species that are being dispersed in the water are mixed, and so it's dispersing the local species as well as introduced species as well. And it just really depends on that. So yes, certainly it's a mechanism for dispersal of seeds. If a species has come here from somewhere else, it's going to go with the flow too.
Could you just quickly describe the sampling, how for these studies? Just
Well, Jackie had seines, and she had one that was the third of the way down on the water column, and then one at the water surface.
I was thinking of the plant on the species richness numbers. You're just taking cross-sections.
Those we have a 20-meter stretch of the river active channel, and we randomly place 18 meter square quadrats.
In the active channel.
It's the river bars and banks and the area that's directly influenced by the low flow channel, and just collect species and vouch for them.
That's it.